Today on The Nation Speaks, a guardian angel seeks to save New York, and a perfect storm at the southern border. Georgia tackles election reform, and a special two-part America Q&A. Hello and welcome to The Nation Speaks. I'm your host, Cindy Drucare. He's been protecting New Yorkers since the 1980s, and now the larger-than-life founder of the Guardian Angels, Curtis Sliwa, wants to be mayor and revive the Big Apple that's been rotting away after a year of lockdowns, riots, and failing businesses. Violent crime is growing and people are leaving. The city that never sleeps needs a wake-up call, and Curtis thinks he can deliver it. Curtis, welcome.
Oh, my pleasure to put my hands across America and be with you today.
So clearly you're the ultimate law and order candidate for New York City here. You've been volunteering to protect our streets since 1979. I mentioned in the intro a lot of the problems the city is facing. I know the Guardian Angels also focuses on prevention, not just protection. So you've been thinking a lot about that. So what do you think it's going to take to fix the city?
Well, we got to get the police department back on track. Remember, their morale is at an all-time low. The forces, the Democratic forces, have pushed to defund the police. They want to defund prisons. And they really want to make the police department impotent. I mean, think about it. We had the finest, most advanced police department in the world, bar none. And now we have a police department that hesitates to respond to the simplest of calls. In addition, we have a no bail law that was imposed on all of us statewide by Andrew Cuomo, the governor, who obviously has his own set of problems right now. But they're not going to rescind that no bail law. So you know, as a criminal, whether you reside in the five boroughs or you're coming in from out of town, that you can be a predicate felon. You can continue to commit crimes over and over. And every time you get arrested, all you're going to do is get a ticket, like a parking ticket or a moving violation, and be told, oh, come to court in 6 months or 8 months. And so we're going to have a repetitive series of violent felons going back out into the streets, encouraging others to do more. So unless we empower the police once again to take control of the streets, how can you have any kind of economic recovery or recovery for a city when people are afraid to take the subways and buses, afraid to come in to a bar or a restaurant for a meal, or when the entertainment centers, Broadway and other venues open up, the cultural and entertainment centers, if they're afraid to come in like we saw in the 70s, then the city is in deep peril. And having survived the 70s, and that was my motivation for starting the Guardian Angels, I know exactly what has to be done in order to get the city back on track.
So how do things compare right now to the 70s?
Well, in the 1970s, we were on the brink of fiscal dissolution, almost declaring bankruptcy. As a result, an incoming mayor then, Ed Koch, had to cut the budget drastically, lay off police, firefighters, social workers, educators. And so we were operating almost in a skeletal structure. So 1 million New York City residents in the five boroughs left in the 1970s alone. Now, so far, this particular cycle, since the lockdown, we've had 300,000 New York City residents leave, mostly from Manhattan, and that number continues. And that's why we're beginning to move in that direction. Now, the one thing you didn't have now that you had in the 70s were the abandoned buildings, gangs dominating whole sections of the city. But that's coming because if you look at Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, AOC, the leader of the Democratic Socialists of America, they have publicly said to any candidates they endorse, any Democrats, there should be no rent paid. No rent paid to private landlords, whether it's commercial property or it's residential rental property or leasing property. And we want to drive the landlords out. And then they hope the city and the state will take over the properties and create affordable housing. That didn't happen in the 70s. That led to massive abandonment, especially in the Bronx and Brooklyn. And property values dropped like a rock, which hastened the departure of so many other New York City residents. So we already seen that. It doesn't work. But obviously, the Democrat Socialists of America are intending on taking over the city council and intent on electing the next mayor of the city of New York. If we go in their direction, this city will continue to fall into the abyss.
So you're running as a Republican. I understand you've never been registered as a Republican before. Is that right?
Correct. My first registration in 1972 was a Democrat. I voted for George McGovern against Richard Nixon. That was a tsunami victory for Richard Nixon. Later on, I got disappointed in the Democrats because they didn't seem at all to be supporting law and order, the preservation of a quality of life, not only in New York City, but other cities where we had Guardian Angels, because we're now in 13 countries and 130 cities. And most importantly, I felt a degree of wanting an independent strain. So I became an independent. And then eventually, for 3 years, the New York State Reform Party chairman. And this past February of a year ago before the lockdown, I registered as a Republican, trying to help them fend off the Democrat Socialists of America who are intent on taking over the city of New York.
Okay, so we know you're tough on crime, and we know what you want to do there. The city does have a lot of financial problems, and presumably a lot of solutions will require investment in the city. So what do you see as the priorities? How would you manage that?
Well, number one, you have to be a cheerleader of the city. You have to raise everyone's expectations. You got to be out there in the retail establishments, because wherever the mayor goes, the cameras and the press will follow. So whether it's bars or restaurants or small mom and pop shops or mid-level sized businesses, you've got to go to Wall Street. You can't vilify them. You can't tell them to take a hike, pal. You can't raise everyone's taxes because you give them another reason to leave the city. You can't impose congestion pricing, which is just another fee, another tax, and then make it so that people driving cars or vehicles will not want to come into Manhattan in order to transact business or to enjoy a nice night out. You basically got to flatten everything out. You have to have a hiring freeze within government, because government is so wasteful in terms of the tax dollars we already have. And most importantly, you got to get on the phone to all those businesses that are being wined and dined to come down to Austin, Texas, Miami Beach, where obviously there are less taxes, right now a better quality of life. Those areas have opened up after the pandemic, where we here in New York City are stifled as a result of the iron fist that both Cuomo and de Blasio have put into any kind of opening up of the city of New York or the state of New York. So it's really going to require me being a salesperson to people to let them know, not only is it, do we want you to come back to New York to spend your dollars, which can be taxed, but we also want you to consider not only moving here and living here, but even if you're not going to have your primary corporate office here anymore, maybe having an adjunct office. So we're going to have to learn to do more with less. Many of the other candidates are talking about giving away money, $1,000 to those that are in need, $5,000. We don't have the money. We're on the verge of fiscal dissolution, of bankruptcy. And most of the Democrats are just talking about as if they were the federal government, where they could print money, raise the debt ceiling, raise the deficit ceiling, like Republicans and Democrats are urging, even though that is going to be a burden to our children and children's children generation. They're the ones who are going to have to pay the price for this. And I'm not going to be one who tries to borrow my way out of this. No way. And I'm not going to be one who hypes up the fact that Joe Biden is the president, a Democratic president, and he has already issued stimulus, which we're going to see flow into the coffers of cities and states. No, we're going to have to pull ourselves up and figure out a way out of this malaise. And it's not going to come from Washington, and it's not going to come from Albany.
And so you mentioned the next generation and children. We have about a minute or so to go, but I know education is also one of the things you care about. What are your plans there?
Well, we have to expand charter schools. We have to, in fact, there's plenty of space now for existing charter schools to expand how many children they can take care of, because there's a lottery system right now. They can only satisfy 1 out of every 8 requests. And we have to impose more vocational training in the public school system, because these young men and women will have negotiable skills. They can get right out into the job market, where right now we're issuing visas for foreign workers because we don't have enough carpenters, electricians, plumbers. In fact, in Google, 1/3 of the program developers are high school graduates. They've never gone on to college because they learned those skills after high school in professional schools that we pay for with Pell Grants that are given at the federal level. Why wouldn't we be giving this training in the public schools when we have a captive audience as we do now?
Excellent. Well, all right. Thank you so much for joining us. And, well, we'll all be watching how New York develops, that's for sure. Thank you, Curtis.
Well, I'm intent on saving New York City. If anybody wants to help, all they have to do to go is to our website, CurtisSliwaForMayor.com, CurtisSliwaForMayor.com.
All right. Coming up next, there's a perfect storm brewing at the southwest border, and it involves executive orders, COVID, drug cartels, and China. But first, here's part one of America Q&A, where we ask our elders how they see young people today.
Our times was going by the rules. Today, we emphasize too much for their well-being.
Too tight indoors, and the situation with the pandemic's only made that worse.
Two thoughts, really. I see the ones that go in the military and study hard, work hard, and try to get ahead. And then there's the other group that would rather stay home and stay on Instagram and Facebook. And I'm also worried about some of the colleges, the way they're teaching courses now that are anti-American.
I feel like they're kind of being shortchanged in some ways. I don't believe that, if we can't allow religion to be taught, I don't think we should be exposing our young people to what is the opposite. They're being influenced by kind of a negative force rather than the positive force that I got.
Hope and promise and passion and a lot of looking down at their cell phones.
They're so creative, responsible. I see hope for the future.
I see them with their nose in computers and missing all the wonderful experiences I had as a child.
When we went to college, we were almost guaranteed a job or a decent paying job, and now they get through college and there's nothing for them, or they end up coming home and living with parents.
I see kids that are struggling very much. I've got a grandson that's 18 and he's having a hard time, honey.
Kids with a lot of energy. Things are changing, technology's changing all the time. They seem to be up with that. One thing is they're really interested in what's going on in the world.
With younger children, I see innocence and openness to learning. They want to know, they want to learn. And as they get older, that's where you pick up the bullying. They're better than somebody else. But that's the anger that they've got, and they've been taught to be racist.
We're a lot better off if we return to the old ways and God and what's really important, instead of all the games and all the modern things and all the people live on their phone constantly. And
Last week, I was at CPAC, the Conservative Political Action Conference, where I got a chance to speak with Texas Attorney General Ken Paxton. Texas is, of course, one of the four U.S. states that borders Mexico, so people there feel the impact of border policies very directly. We know that President Trump took an extremely hard line on illegal immigration, while President Biden has vowed to treat the threat at the border as more of a humanitarian project. And to that end, he's already reversed a number of Trump-era rules, one of which was recently challenged in court, successfully, by Ken Paxton. Here's what he had to say about it. You're a big man in the news these days after suing the Biden administration to stop the deportation order. You got an injunction, and now that's permanently stopped. What happens next?
So it's a big victory, because when you get an injunction, you have to show the court, the judge, that you're likely to win at trial on the merits, which means he thinks you're going to win later. And second, that your state would suffer irreparable harm if the injunction wasn't granted. In this case, it was granted, which means that the federal government, the president, still has to enforce the law that Congress passed, which is he has to still deport illegals under the law. He was trying to just eliminate the law for 100 days. He can't do that under the Constitution. So there's a couple of different possibilities. That injunction will either get appealed to the Fifth Circuit, or the Department of Justice will wait and we'll just go to trial on the merits at some point, in the next, who knows, months.
So what's your argument about irreparable harm?
So because if you open the border, one, there's tremendous risk to my citizens that more COVID comes in because we don't know the health status of these people. Second, we have an amazing costs, very significant costs as it relates to human trafficking, drug trafficking, and other crimes. So we have law enforcement costs. We also will have to educate people. We'll have to pay for their health care. We'll have to pay for some people's food. It's a significant cost to my state, both on the idea of just economic cost, but also personal cost.
And are you talking to other border attorney generals about doing similar actions, or what you can do in general to fight open border type policies?
Yeah, so Arizona, for example, Mark Brnovich filed a similar lawsuit. He's doing a great job in Arizona. So we are also having meetings coming up to discuss some of these issues among the Republican attorney generals.
And so are you watching these caravans, and what are you thinking?
Oh,
is going to happen
absolutely.
there?
I mean, it reminds me of the Obama years and the beginning of the Trump years, before Trump made the case for border security and gave Border Patrol and Customs and Immigration the authority to do their jobs, which they didn't have under Obama, and started building the wall and started sending the message that if you come and use asylum, which has been used as a loophole, you don't get to stay here and disappear into the United States and never to be heard from again. So those policies are being undone, which is going to create great damage to the country.
Are you already seeing the impact of that?
It's just beginning. The weather kind of probably slowed it down because we had some very cold weather. Certainly. But I think as the weather gets warmer, I think you're going to start seeing some of those impacts, and they're not good.
Excellent. Well, thank you so much for joining us. I really appreciate it.
Thanks, Cindy. It's great being on.
My next two guests come with valuable insights into what's happening at the border, and to them, there's no looming crisis. The crisis is already here. In recent months, there's been a huge surge in people and drugs crossing illegally into the United States. And what we need to realize, regardless of personal politics, is that all of that traffic is controlled by the drug cartels. So we're joined by Sheriff Mark Dannels of Cochise County, Arizona. Sheriff, welcome.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
So we've been hearing a lot about spikes in unaccompanied minors crossing the border, and I know in your county you have about 83 miles of Mexican border, so that's a big issue for you. What do things look like right now in Cochise County?
Well, going back to about August, we've seen an uptick in smuggling, mainly on the human side of it, and also an uptick with the drugs. We had about 1,200 off our camera system. We run our own virtual system here at the Sheriff's Office. We had about 1,200 off our camera system. In December, we had over 2,500 and over 500 pounds of illicit drugs that we seized off our system. Since that time, over the last couple months, that uptick just continues to rise. We're looking at numbers back in 2019 where the caravans and surge numbers were impacting the southwest border, and we're seeing the same thing going on again.
What accounts for it?
Well, I think the biggest thing on the southwest border, and it starts in Washington, D.C. with our congressional people, with our President of the United States, is the message that's being sent. And right now, the message of obviously the rescinding of declaring the southwest border a non-emergency, which took away resources, funding, the physical barrier, the MPP program, the Migrant Protection Protocol, rescinding that and bringing them into the United States. And overall, just the overall message that it's okay to come in the United States right now. And the concern on that is, and I look at it beyond the humanitarian side of this, which is very important to me, but is the public safety side of this, the element that we're going to see as we did in 2019, the criminal element that was exploiting the cartels, our southwest border. The other aspect of it is that worries me is we're in a pandemic. We're in a health pandemic. We got 26 countries that have been banned from coming to the United States because of the COVID, but we're opening up the southwest border. So do I think it's hypocritical? I really do. I mean, our southwest border is part of the United States. All borders should be treated equally. Our public transportation should be treated equally when it comes to whether you're a citizen or not. But we're not seeing that down here. What we're seeing is these people being released in communities, relying on NGOs, the non-government organizations, to take care of them. If not, the communities absorb them. And right now, that's a scary thought. We don't have the resources in rural counties. So to me as a sheriff, along with my fellow sheriffs on the southwest border that are standing up against this. We'll continue to do that because my job is to protect all my citizens in my county, and my oath is to keep them safe. So that's what I'm speaking to you about today.
Can you just give us a sense of what your border looks like? What's the terrain? Are there walls?
Well, we have a very rugged, mountainous, desert terrain here in Cochise County. The border fencing, the physical barrier was being built. The extension of that, the upgrade of our fencing to going into New Mexico, all the way going west out of our county. When that executive order was signed by President Biden, it halted everything. Within hours, people were laid off. The equipment's still sitting down there. The trucks are sitting down there abandoned. The steel is sitting abandoned. There's 6-foot trenches on my southwest border. It's a mess. I'll be totally honest with you. That was a very hasty decision. I don't think it was collective in nature, where this administration had worked with our governor, our attorney general, our state health, our local health, and I'm sure it didn't work with our sheriffs.
Now, you're, as I understand, or maybe you aren't still on the Homeland Security Advisory Council. Are you on that council still?
I'm on that council. I'm also the chairman of the National Sheriff Association for Border Security throughout the United States. And I was not, but let me rephrase that for a minute. When it comes to the plan, what's going on, what we're seeing today, I was not addressed. I was not asked about, Sheriff, how should we roll this out? No, I was not asked about that. I was part of the Biden transition team when it comes to, there's 4 sheriffs, 5 sheriffs selected by the National Sheriff Association to speak to the transition team for President Biden, kind of address issues. And I spoke about our southwest border, the things that are working. We've done a lot of good work on this southwest border, and that's probably why I'm standing up a little tall on this, in the fact that I believe we've gone so far in a good way. So many successful programs under public safety, national security, and the humanitarian side of this, and to include the health pandemic we're dealing with in this country. And to not consult us or get us at the table, we can have all the stakeholders there, local, state, and federal, working together. I think that was a misstep, huge misstep.
So what policies exactly were working, and are they rescinded or still in place or just not enforced? What's the situation?
Well, as a member of the advisory council, just what it is, advisory to our Secretary of Homeland Security in a room, I bring a community voice to that. Nobody brought me to the table and said, Sheriff, or as a member of the National Sheriff Association, when it comes to, here's the plan we want to roll out. I was told in a meeting several weeks ago with sheriffs, after all these policies were being implemented, we asked for a meeting with DHS leadership. We sat down with them. The statement was made to us that they've been looking at this plan, the reversal of these plans, since and before the election. So this has been going on for some time. Nobody has sat down with me and said, Sheriff, what do you think? What do you think we should do? How should we roll this out? What stakeholders should be at the table? In fact, when I suggested that we should have sheriffs, health officials, governors, your border governors on this committee, they said they hadn't thought of that. And that was just a couple of weeks ago. So obviously communities, which is the direct impact of everything going on these decisions, should have been at the table from the onset.
So what exact impacts are you seeing in your community over the last few months?
Over the last few months, we've had our pursuits, just our pursuits, when it comes to smuggling, whether smuggling, and I call it modern day slavery, when you take humans and you put them in servant roles and you try to smuggle them into the country, only to be servant to the cartels within these communities, whether it be under gangs, drugs, sex trafficking, whatever it may be. It's not a way of life most Americans enjoy, our freedoms and our liberties. So what we're seeing a lot of is the human smuggling. The more messages that we put that the border is open, that it's okay to come in illegally, and then the consequences are nil to none, we're going to get more and more people coming in this country, and that should scare every American. But we're seeing a lot of pursuits. On the way over to this meeting today, there was a pursuit in my county again. My supervisor just spoke to me a few minutes ago, talking about there's like 5 different pursuits over the last 24 hours, very short time. In our county over the last few months, we've had 12 people go to the hospital. We've had 2 killed as a result of smuggling, and we've had a shootout with a smuggler. So when I say the uptick's up, it's there. I mean, we've enjoyed the benefit of collaborative efforts, collective efforts, local prosecutions, working with our federal partners, all the way through to make Cochise County and our southwest border so much safer. And so this is this is a little disheartening to see where we're going now again.
And are you talking to other sheriffs that are experiencing similar things along the border?
We speak every day, and throughout the day we speak. I get updates from them all the way through, and our National Sheriff Association. So yeah, we're very inclusive in what we're talking about, making sure those facts are shared back with our communities, what we know, what we can share with them. When you don't share information or you don't roll out a plan that includes your local and state stakeholders, confusion and frustration gets very high. So my job is to bring those facts back into them and also tell them that we're going to do everything we can to keep our community safe.
So we have to wrap up shortly, but what would be the 1 or 2 top priorities that you would like to see addressed?
Well, the first thing starts with public safety. How do we ensure that the people coming across our southwest border are those that are not going to violate our rules, our norms that go within our communities? Make sure that the proper people are being vetted within our country. And that goes for national security too. And then the other one would be humanitarian. I mean, leaving these people in the hands of the cartel. They paid us $6,000 to $9,000 a head for the cartel to bring them in here and then get them into the interior of the United States. Again, not good. That's a criminal enterprise that I truly believe is going to exploit what's going on the southwest border. And last but not least is the health pandemic that we're all enduring in this country, and we have for the last year. We need to make sure that these people are being tested. Now, I'm being told, the leadership down here, that that's not happening. If you look at the press releases, which I think they use choice of very kind words and saying, oh yeah, we're testing them. The only time they're being tested is if they go into an ICE detention facility. But if they get caught and released within hours, they're not being tested. So we need to come together, and last but not least, to sum it all up, is we need to be working together, local, state, and federal, because we all serve the same oath, and that is to protect Americans.
Well, thank you very much, Sheriff, for sharing that with us today.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
Certainly sobering to hear from someone like Sheriff Dannels, who's on the front lines dealing with this every day. But the situation is even more complex than we heard from him, as we're about to learn from our next guest. And we're joined now by Derek Maltz. He's a former head of the DEA Special Operations Division. Welcome.
Thank you very much, Cindy. Appreciate it.
So we were just speaking to a sheriff, and we're hearing how there's upticks in minors crossing the southern border, as well as drugs, human trafficking of all sorts. And we hear a lot about the Mexican cartels. Can you give us some insight into that? I know it's not just Mexican cartels. There's a China connection here, too. Can you explain to us how all this works together?
Okay, so first of all, it's got to be very clear that we're facing a public safety, national security, and humanitarian crisis all at the same time at the border. We have these violent, very, very violent Mexican cartels that are flooding the streets of America with poisonous drugs that are killing our citizens at record levels. CDC statistics have shown approximately 82,000 Americans died in a 12-month period. That's the latest statistics. And the rates just keep going up. They anticipate over 84,000 in the year 2020. So we have a crisis like we've never seen. But behind that crisis, we have China that's sending these unbelievable precursor chemicals and pure fentanyl to Mexico. They're also working very closely with the cartels on the money laundering services business. So a lot of Americans don't understand the role of China and how they've increased their emphasis in the drug crisis. They recognize how American families are being, they're suffering, kids are dying at record levels, and they're making billions of dollars working with the cartels. So we have a very dangerous, perfect storm on the border, and unfortunately, we don't have a lot of engagement with the politicians. They're actually in denial. The DHS secretary this week has said that we don't have a crisis on the border, but if you speak to the CBP and the Border Patrol and the professionals, sheriffs, and the police agencies that are dealing with this chaos, you'll recognize that, once again, Washington is misleading the public.
Okay, I have a lot of questions based on that, but let me just ask you, if China wasn't involved, how different would the situation look? How big a part are they playing?
Well, in regards to the chemicals, the cartels have been acquiring precursor chemicals from many countries for many years. But if you notice, you're seeing an uptick in the amount of methamphetamine that is being seized all over America. That's because China is playing a much more prominent role in the chemicals, and they have a direct pipeline. I'm going to share something with you that opened my eyes. So in 2007, we had a Chinese national that was arrested in Mexico City with $207 million in $100 denominations. That was like the largest cash seizure in the history of the world on a drug case that I'm aware of. And it was from a Chinese national that was bringing in precursor chemicals and working with the Sinaloa cartel and other cartels as they were sending these chemicals to these precursor chemicals into the lab operations. They were industrial style labs. They were not mom and pop production laboratories producing ton quantities every single week. So we're facing this new, very pure methamphetamine, but China is playing an intricate role in the chemicals. With the fentanyl, of course, we all know how the fentanyl is now killing folks. The counterfeit pills that they're putting out, the Mexi-Oxy, that's all over America, the little blue pills. But the Chinese are also providing the pill presses to the cartels. They're providing the expertise, the chemical expertise, the chemistry expertise. And so they're playing a very prominent role. But remember this, the drug organizations in Mexico are looking to make as much money as they can. And without the chemicals and without the money, they're out of business. And China is playing that prominent role right now, especially on the money services in America. That's something that's relatively new, and it's starting to boom.
How new is it?
Well, it's been around for a few years. I mean, but law enforcement is finally really infiltrating it. They're making arrests. They have plenty of money couriers that they're stopping. They're starting to put the pieces together, but it's very elaborate money laundering. So I'll give you an example. They have the Chinese working in Mexico with the cartels. They're giving the cartels need, let's say, $1 million picked up in Las Vegas, as an example. They send the Chinese national young kids. They meet with the drug traffickers. They pick up the cash. They turn the cash over to these legitimate, in many cases, business guys in America that are having a problem getting their cash out of China. There's restrictions on the amount of cash you can export out of China on an annual basis. So they're taking the dirty cash in America, and what they do, Cindy, is they transfer the $1 million over their banking apps from one Chinese bank account to another, and then they have the money already moved overseas without putting the cash inside a U.S. bank where it's easy for government officials to track it. Then a lot of times they'll buy consumer goods in China like sneakers, computers, toys, clothing, and they'll ship that $1 million worth of goods to Mexico, Panama, Colombia, South America, wherever, and then they'll sell the goods for $2 or $3 million, so everybody's making money. But unfortunately, U.S. law enforcement is having a difficult time infiltrating in the undercover manners that historically they've been very successful with the Hispanic money launderers, right? We had plenty of informants, plenty of expertise. We understood the culture. Now we have a situation where we don't have a lot of undercovers that speak Chinese. We don't have a lot of informants. They're starting to develop them because law enforcement is very talented. They're going to continue to infiltrate them, but it's overwhelming and it's very creative. And now with cryptocurrency and Bitcoin, it's becoming more difficult to track. So law enforcement has their hands full, but they're very relentless. They'll continue, but Americans are dying at record levels. So we have to get more of a sense of urgency, and we have to stop misleading the public. And thank you for bringing up these important issues.
Wow, what a complex situation it is. So from what I know about China, the communist regime would almost have to be behind this if it's operating at this large of a scale. Do you know anything about that?
So that's a great question. So obviously, I'll just give you some background. When we were targeting the Afghan kingpins for many years, when we arrested a couple of them, one guy in particular made a comment that selling heroin to the West is a jihad against America. So it's the same concept. Communist China is trying to undermine and destabilize America. We're the biggest adversary for the economic power that they want. So they know that these drugs are destroying our communities. So although I don't personally have concrete evidence that communist China is behind all of this synthetic drug manufacturing and all this drug business, from every expert that I've spoken to, you can't really run these illegal chemical businesses in China sending chemicals around the world without them controlling it, right? You can't communicate freely in this communist country. So in my opinion, we have a chemical war with as the unrestricted warfare to destroy America without actually sending any missiles or any weapons in our country. They're very sophisticated, very smart, and right now they're beating us at this game. And by the way, just so you know, back in around 2010, we had another crisis from Chinese labs out of Wuhan and other areas with the synthetic drugs, the cannabinoids, the cathinones, bath salts, K2 spice. We had a situation in 2018 where in New Haven, Connecticut, Washington, D.C., New York City, Chicago, people dropping all over the place, respiratory failure, cardiac arrest, death in some cases because of these synthetic drugs that people were smoking in the synthetic marijuana they were buying from these gas stations around America. They were putting rat poison in it. So we have some enemies around the world that love undermining our system by hurting our citizens. And that's what we have going on.
Wow. So you say law enforcement is, smart and, getting on the case. Who's working together on this specifically on the China angle?
So another great question. I appreciate you, with the insight that you have. Unfortunately, right now, the morale in law enforcement out there is not too good because our politicians and leaders are talking about defunding the police. We have police that are afraid to take law enforcement action because they don't want to destroy their families and their lives with social media and this cancel culture that we have all over America. But law enforcement is very resilient. They'll continue to work. We have percentages of 15 to 20% of the workforce is going to carry the load. So we have the federal agencies, we have the Department of Justice, we have different strategies that were implemented under the last administration where they have task forces to go after these violent transnational criminals. And they've had some successes, but it's becoming very overwhelming. And the biggest issue, Cindy, from my perspective, is the total lack of respect and support for the men and women on the front lines doing the real difficult job, sacrificing their family life, sacrificing their family time with their kids. So we have a very, very serious situation. And law enforcement, like I said, that right now, you got to remember, these global transnational crime organizations, they don't have a bureaucracy. They don't have any rules. They don't have any budget constraints. They don't have the politicians in the way of them doing business. They have an agenda, and they're going to carry out their agenda. Law enforcement has to follow all these rules. Many of these rules are archaic. The laws, some of these congressmen and women, they have cobwebs in their ears and their eyes. They don't even know how to use the internet. They don't even understand social media. But now we have these encrypted apps in the hands of these Chinese international criminals that are all encrypted. So we don't even have a way to infiltrate their encrypted apps. So there's very, very difficult, complex issues. But the scary part from my perspective as a parent, okay, and as somebody that has a lot of passion for America, is the lack of discussion about this. This is not a political topic, by the way. The death of Americans is a red, white, and blue issue. It's not a red issue or a blue issue, Republicans and Democrats. It's about America. So I'm surprised the Democrats haven't recognized that their constituents are dying all over the place as well. So it's a very complex matter, and I'm going to continue to engage. I might testify next week at the Judiciary Committee based on the whole crisis and those that are out there trying to legalize drugs and don't even understand the type of drugs we're dealing with today. So it's really, really difficult, but we'll continue to fight. We have no option.
All right, we're out of time. Thank you so much for coming today, Derek, and sharing that with us. I really appreciate it.
Thank you. Anytime you need anything, please let me know.
Here's part 2 of our special America Q&A. What do our older, wiser neighbors miss about being a kid?
I guess responsibility. You don't have the responsibilities that you have now.
It says in the Bible, when I became a man, I gave up childish things.
What I miss is the good times. I mean, we were very poor. The opportunities as a kid to grow in a more less normal way.
Fields I could play in, trees I could climb.
The lack of responsibility and being able to kind of do what I wanted to, you know, and not be worried about the whole world. I was only worried about my neighborhood.
Having my mother do my laundry.
Playing with all the other kids and spending more time.
About being a kid, I miss my dad taking me on camping trips in the mountains and riding our horses and taking care of our goats and chickens and stuff.
The freedom to do what you want.
Very definitely the simplicity. And I think we push too hard on our young people.
Being innocent and carefree and climbing and running and really enjoying life more without knowing how serious and intense it can be.
Playing, being innocent, being safe, of not worrying about where I went, what I did, riding down the street, nobody was going to bother me, just being safe.
More free than kids are today, running the neighborhood, riding your bicycle, knowing when to be home when you heard that whistle from your dad in the driveway.
Oh, that's been so long for us.
It's been a long time ago, but yeah, it was just that the things were so much different and so much simpler. And
when you were a kid, you didn't have near the worries you do as an adult.
Georgia was under the microscope after the November election, where Joe Biden ended up beating President Trump by less than 1/4 of a percentage point. There were multiple rounds of recounts, and poll workers testified about a long list of irregularities. Afterwards, lawmakers promised to pass reforms to restore public trust in the process. Well, that's happened, with Georgia's House and Senate both recently passing election reform bills. We talked to two of the people who were demanding change and see if they think those bills go far enough. We're joined now by Marci McCarthy. She's a DeKalb County voter review panelist in the last elections, and she's also running for chair of the DeKalb County GOP, and Jason M. Shepard. He's currently the chair of the Cobb County GOP and running for chair of the Georgia GOP. Welcome to you both. Welcome back to the show.
Thank you, Cindy.
Thanks for having us.
So Georgia, there was a lot of talk about, vote integrity during the last elections in Georgia, and both the House and the Senate in Georgia have passed bills to address a lot of these issues. So I wanted to get your reaction on how happy you are with these bills. So Jason, why don't you start us off?
Well, I think this is a step in the right direction to restoring people's faith in the integrity of elections here in Georgia. I think a lot of Georgia voters were concerned in both the November election and the runoff on January 5th about whether their vote counted or not. And I think we saw the results of that. A lot of people chose not to vote because they were concerned about the integrity of the system. So I'm very excited that both the Georgia House and Georgia Senate have passed election reform bills that are designed to help really restore election integrity in Georgia and people's confidence in the system. So we'll see what the final outcome of both the bills are. Obviously, the House and Senate will need to get together and decide what provisions will stay and which will go before it finally gets passed and goes on to the governor's desk for his signature.
Okay, good. I'd like to hear which provisions you think are especially good, but Marci, why don't you give us your reaction first? Are you happy with what they've put forward?
Yeah, I echo what Jason said. It's really about restoring fitness, faith, integrity, and trust in our elections. And we've got to do so by verifying our votes. We certainly trust the voter out there, but we need to verify that it is the actual voter that is voting. So I'm really elated to see this advancement of both bills coming through, and I'm hopeful that our governor will be signing those.
Mm-hmm.
So it looks like, speaking to what you just said, that ID for absentee voting would now be required. That wasn't required before. Do you think that's one of the key things?
We have to have the same processes in place, whether you are voting in person as well as if you're voting via absentee ballot. Trust but verify your vote is not voter suppression. It is about ensuring that the legal vote that is cast is counted, and it is you as the elector that is voting.
I think having voter ID for absentee voting as well is one of the most important provisions. In fact, a few years ago, a group of election observers from the United Nations came to Georgia, and they were shocked that we didn't have a uniform system when it came to checking for voter ID. That's what happens in almost every country in the world that's a democratic nation that allows people to vote, that everyone must have an ID. And this was a huge gap in the system that allowed people to really vote without proving who they were. Of course, any illegal vote that happens takes away a vote from a legitimate voter. In addition to that, we saw lots of issues dealing with food trucks and various other handouts happening while people were waiting in line. It's called warming the line, and those existed in sort of a gray area. Obviously, you can't bribe people to vote, but what they were saying was, and we really don't know who was paying for these food trucks, these pizza trucks, these taco trucks that would sit in the parking lot and hand out free breakfast burritos or slices of pizza to people waiting in line. The law basically says anyone should be able to come and get the food or the giveaway that's being given, whether they're voting or not. But a lot of these food trucks, whoever was paying for them, were only giving them to voters in line. And we were having to spend a lot of time, a lot of resources to basically have them chased off in this illegal activity. Now the law will say, if it gets through to the governor, that that type of action is completely illegal. And that will allow our election monitors, our poll watchers, to concentrate on what's happening at the polling place rather than dealing with free giveaways in the parking lot. Additionally, no excuse absentee voting was passed when absentee voting and election day voting were the only two options. Now we have weeks of early voting and where people can go even on weekends to early vote, and that really calls into question whether no excuse absentee voting is still needed. Even when there was an excuse required, I voted absentee because all you have to do is say you're out of town. Well, if you're in the metro Atlanta and you live in Marietta like I do but work in Atlanta, well, you may be out of town on election day, so you could still request it. On the other hand, no excuse absentee voting opens up a huge gap where potential fraud can happen, where ballots can be requested by people who really are not even eligible voters at addresses where they've moved from and still cast a ballot in Georgia. We saw issues of that in November and in the runoff in January. So I think what's critical is getting no excuse absentee voting taken off in Georgia. 20 states require excuses to vote absentee, including New York, which obviously New York is not exactly a bastion of republicanism, and even the president's own home state, Delaware. If Joe Biden wants to vote absentee in his home state, Delaware, he has to have an excuse. So we're just saying, with all these weeks of early voting, let's go back to having an excuse like maybe you're in a nursing home, you know you're going to be in hospital, you know you're going to be out of town on election day. Otherwise, there's plenty of opportunity for you to early vote in the weeks before the election.
So what I understand is that's in the Senate bill, but not the House bill, and both have been passed by their respective houses, so we're not sure if that will end up finally law or not. Is that right?
That's correct.
All right. And Marci, what about you? What do you think are where did this fall short?
Well, actually, I was going to actually talk about some of the other things that are in the bills that are really exciting because if that's okay. One of the things that I was really pleased to see was no third-party funding can be allocated from any type of organization to a county elections office. In the metro area, we saw not a nonprofit organization affiliated with Facebook funding the drop boxes and the motor buses that are the motor voting units overall. And that's election interference at the end of the day. So I don't understand how that was even allowed to have happened, to take a third-party funding for an elections office to supplement the resources in name of COVID. So that actually addresses that as well. In the House bill, one of the things that was really exciting to me to have there as a voter review panelist, and what we didn't have happen in the general and in the special election was the fact of the matter was we had election office workers duplicating ballots in an unsupervised manner when the scanning systems could not read the actual absentee ballot. So they were acting as a de facto review panel. In the new legislation, the bipartisan review panel will do the duplication of the ballots when the scanning system, I should say, cannot read the ballots. And that offers the faith, integrity, and trust in elections that we really need if you are voting by absentee ballot. So I was very pleased to see that type of legislation in there. A lot of the legislation in general addresses many things that went wrong in our election process, but really never were exposed because some of this stuff was quite obscure. The absentee ballot voting in Georgia was really comprised of about 250,000 ballots as compared to, in the general election, 1.2 million ballots overall. So we really overwhelmed a system that was not set up to have the kind of volume of absentee ballots, and many things went awry. So this legislation really is an opportunity for us to restore fitness in Georgia's elections.
And just to add one other point, those boxes that you talked about, now they will have to be, if all this legislation becomes law, they will have to be in the early voting centers, not
That's also a plus, because we had a lot of issues as associated with where there's actual filming taking place of the person coming to the drop box. And the drop boxes were supplemental, basically mailboxes overall, and they weren't really being 24/7 monitored as suggested. Just having a video camera is not monitoring it. Someone actually has to be watching the video feed going on. So having them in places where there are other security measures in place also preserves a chain of custody of the ballot. And a lot of that went awry in our last election.
So, Jason, are there places where you feel this legislation falls short?
Well, I think one of the places it falls short, and actually it's a place that's not really addressed by the legislation at all, and that is in prosecuting actual voter fraud that happened in the 2020 election and in the subsequent runoff. Right now, the Secretary of State's office had saying that they have over 60 investigations going on, but they also had investigations going on during the primary where over 1,400 voters voted twice, once by mail and absentee voting, but also in person. That's a felony in the state of Georgia. We also have felons who have not received their right to vote back who voted in the election. Those felons are not being prosecuted for violating the election law, at least not yet. I think what will also be critical to restoring confidence is that the Secretary of State and the Attorney General really work together to make sure that those who have broken the election laws that are already on the books are prosecuted to the fullest extent of the law and are shown as an example that if you try to cheat in Georgia's elections, we will come after you and we will prosecute you. Because one of the most sacred rights that we have is the right to vote. And when someone tries to steal our right to vote by fraudulent means, I mean, that's really taking away one of our fundamental rights that we enjoy as Americans and that we enjoy as Georgians. So I think that needs to happen even before we pass any new laws to kind of close those loopholes that we have seen in the 2020 election and really to help restore true voter integrity in the state of Georgia.
Now, both these bills were passed by Republican House or Republican Senate. I don't think there was a single Democrat that voted for them, certainly not in the House. So do you think this will restore overall confidence or create a better system, or is it just, Republicans are happy about what's going on? And I know the Democrats, at least, they think the voter ID and a lot of the provisions about, the weekend voting is voter suppression. So what is the mood in Georgia right now? Marci, go ahead.
This is about trust but verify your vote. So again, this is not about voter suppression, making it harder for you to vote. This is ensuring that your legal vote is actually counted by the person who cast the actual vote. So we have to do a better job of messaging that getting that message out there to our community. But at the end of the day, it is truly about trust but verify your vote, in that we do trust the person that is voting through the identification process, voter ID, but we're verifying that it is you, the person that is voting. We want to ensure that somebody else is not voting on your behalf or using your name in vain to cast a vote. We had several folks that utilized the absentee ballot process system who had a vote cast in their name early, but when they came to vote in person only to find that somebody had voted in their name. So again, this is really about trust but verify your vote. It is not about making it harder to vote, and it's not anything close to voter suppression. To assume that somebody that doesn't have an ID or know how to use the state will give you an ID if you can't afford an ID, even if you don't drive a car or anything like that. We need voter ID. We just need ID in general to cash a check, buy cigarettes, alcohol, sometimes use a credit card, get on an airplane, check into a hotel.
Well, true voter suppression is stealing someone's vote. I mean, that's what voter suppression is. It's not having having to wait more than a half an hour to vote. That's not voter suppression. I can remember in 1984 with my mother standing in that long line at the high school gymnasium in Champaign, Illinois, where it seemed like everyone was there to vote for Ronald Reagan. I remember 1992, we had 5-hour-long waits in Cherokee County, one of the most Republican counties in Georgia, in order to vote because they didn't have enough voting machines. If it's important to do, if it's important to the person, then we'll wait as long as we can to vote. People camp out overnight for the newest iPhone. That's not iPhone suppression. What it is vote suppression of illegal votes, not legal votes, but illegal votes. And the Democrats don't want illegal votes suppressed. And that seems to be very clear. In fact, we're now seeing a lot of information coming out in the media that Stacey Abrams' group was actually sending message out trying to suppress the vote in the runoff by really ginning up the idea that people's votes didn't matter and that they would be stolen because of election integrity. That's voter suppression. And once again, it's the Democrats engaged in it. This will tighten up the election, and it doesn't matter if you're a Republican or Democrat or independent or libertarian. You will know in Georgia that your vote will count if you legally vote. If you illegally vote, you will know that your vote won't count, and hopefully you'll go to jail to contemplate on what you did.
All right. Well, thank you both so much for joining us.
Thank you, Cindy.
Thanks for having us.
And that's all for today's show. Thank you so much for watching The Nation Speaks. Join us every Saturday, 11 a.m. to noon Eastern. And from all of us here, have a great week.
Don't let YouTube decide what information you get. That's your choice. YouTube is deleting our videos and cuts you off from a source of honest reporting. Make sure you don't lose access to NTD's news content, and take a quick moment to subscribe to our newsletter so no matter what happens here, you'll keep your access to a trustworthy news source.